To this day, controversy remains about the death of a woman who was travelling from Liverpool to London on a narrowboat in Victorian England. At 37 years old, Christina Collins had been married twice. Her first husband had been Thomas Ingleby, a Scotsman who travelled all round the country as a magician, and she acted as his assistant. Following his death in Ireland, he left his widowed wife with little or no money. Soon Christina met Robert Collins, and in 1838 they were finally married after a long courtship. The couple went to Liverpool where they looked for work, but Collins was unsuccessful. That being the case, the decision was made to go to London, so he set off, leaving his new wife in Liverpool, where she found employment as a dressmaker with Mrs. Elizabeth Grice. Meanwhile, Collins found work pretty quickly and settled into lodgings at 10 Edgware Road. He wrote to his wife, sending her a guinea so she could travel down to be with him once more. Unfortunately, the guinea wasn't enough for a coach fare to the capital, but it was enough for her to find passage on a narrowboat. It would be a long, slow journey, but at least she and Collins would be reunited. On Saturday, 15th June 1839, with her bags packed, Christina left Liverpool and made her way to Preston Brook on the Trent and Mersey Canal, where she boarded the Staffordshire knot, owned by Pickfords. It was due to sail to Stoke-on-Trent, Rugeley, Fradley Junction, then on to Coventry and London. On that day, Christina was wearing a dark-coloured gown, a fawn handkerchief at her neck, and a blue silk bonnet with a ribbon. On the boat were the crew, made up of James Owen, the captain, and 2 boatmen, George Thomas or Dobble, and William Ellis or Lambert. There was also a cabin boy, William Muston or Musson. During the trip, Christina realised that the boat stopped more than she'd expected, with the crew visiting the local alehouses and drinking until they were drunk before returning to the boat. When the boat stopped at Stoke Wharf, for example, Owen had 7 pints, while Christina stayed on the boat reading a novel, as witnessed by another Pickford employee, George Neville. By the time the boat reached Walton, Christina was fearful for her safety from the crew, who were now very drunk. She spoke to the canal clerk, Hugh Cordwell, telling him she feared they would meddle with her. Cordwell, unbelievably, told her that if anything did happen to her, to report it at Journey's End. Meanwhile, the boat rammed the lock gates, followed by shouting from Owen, and although it was eventually sorted out, Christina decided to walk along the canal towpath. She managed to outwalk the boat and ended up having to wait for it at Aston, where the lockkeeper's wife, Catherine Tansley, saw her waiting at around 8:30 p.m. One of the men saw her as the boat approached the lock, shouting out, "Curse her eyes! I wish she was in hell flames." This made her burst into tears. Catherine Tansley also witnessed 2 men on the boat quarrelling and heard George Thomas say he wouldn't work on the boat any longer if she were allowed to be in the cabin instead of the passenger space reserved for passengers. Owen tried to calm things, but Thomas turned round and said that if he paid him his 10 shillings in wages, he'd leave the boat there and then. Although upset, Christina had no choice but to rejoin the boat. When it reached Myuu Lock, the lockkeeper, John Mills's wife, Anne, heard a woman's cry at around midnight. On hearing it, she got up and looked out the bedroom window. She saw a woman on the deck crying quietly. She called out, "What's up?" But one of the boatmen replied that they had been in the canal, at which point the woman stepped off the boat and asked for her shoes. She then bent down and put them on. Mrs. Mills then heard Christina say to one of the men on the boat, "Don't attempt me, I'll not go down." Mrs. Mills then asked one of the boatmen who the woman was, and one of them replied that she was a passenger, along with her husband. A blatant lie. At around dawn on the Monday morning, a boatman called Thomas Grant was making his way to Brindley Bank near Rugeley when he spotted something floating in the water around 4 feet from the edge. It was the body of Christina. She was wearing a blue-spotted gown and blue stockings, a white petticoat, and a pair of drawers, but wore no bonnet or shoes. The body of the dress was slightly torn, where the sleeve had been ripped from it, as was her fawn neckerchief. Using his boat to steer the body, he coaxed it towards the bank, where John Johnson, a wharfinger, dragged the still warm Christina out of the water. The local police constable arrived as soon as the alarm was raised. The body was carried or dragged up the nearby steps, leading to the top of the steep bank, then taken to the Talbot Inn in the village. Her blood covered the steps, and they have since been known as the Bloody Steps. At around 6 a.m, Owen, who was recovering from drinking so much, approached Woodend Lock and spoke to the lockkeeper's wife, stating, "I doubt we have had a passenger drowned." Asked where, he couldn't say. He went on to say she had been dragged out of the canal onto the boat and into the cabin, stating she seemed deranged. Further on at Fradley Junction, Owen told Charles Rowbottom, the Pickford clerk, while the horses were being changed, that they'd had a passenger, but that she'd drowned herself. The police constable at Fasley, William Harrison, was informed of the strange goings-on by Rowbotham and waited for the boat to arrive. Immediately, the officer could see all the crew were inebriated, so called for backup. Then the 3 boatmen were handcuffed and taken to the local police station for further questioning. In the cabin, Harrison found Christina's crushed blue bonnet and her shoes, which were tied together, along with a pair of clogs and a woman's apron, which Owen claimed to belong to his wife, but stated everything else belonged to their passenger. Young Musson asked to be questioned and went on to identify the body as that of their passenger, Mrs. Collins. A post-mortem examination was carried out by Mr. Samuel Barnett, the local surgeon. He found 2 small bruises, but nothing else. He concluded that she died of suffocation caused by drowning, perhaps wrongly insinuating that she'd been strangled first, then thrown into the water, where she'd drowned. He also stated that she'd not been interfered with, but how he could tell is still open to debate. On the following Monday morning, the inquest found the 3 men guilty of the murder of Christina, but Musson was admonished of any wrongdoing and was allowed to go free. At Stafford on Tuesday, 23rd July 1839, the trial of the three men got under way in front of Mr. Justice Sir John Williams. The jury was directed by the judge that the charge of them feloniously assaulting her should be dropped, as there was insufficient evidence, and the three were acquitted. However, there was still a murder charge to be tried at the court, and things took a dramatic turn when Joseph Orgel, a man serving 18 months for bigamy and cellmate of Owen's, told the court that Owens had said the other two men, Thomas and Ellis, committed an indecent assault upon her and mauled her to death. Orgel knew that if he told the court this, he would have to be pardoned before taking the stand at the second trial. With Orgel stating what he did, the three boatmen languished in jail for another 8 months. On Monday, 16th March 1840, the boatmen's trial got under way at Staffordshire Hall before Judge Sir John Gurney. The prosecution case was led by Sergeant Ludlow and Mr. F. V. Lee, while Owen was defended by Mr. Godson, Thomas by Mr. Yardley, and Ellis by Mr. Beedon. Following the evidence and witness statements, all three were found guilty of the murder of Christina Collins and sentenced to hang. On Saturday, 11th April 1840, Ellis, Owen and Thomas were read their last rites, but as they were being led to the scaffold, 28-year-old Ellis was reprieved. His sentence was commuted to transportation to Australia for 14 years' hard labour. He burst into tears and said to the other two, "God bless you, dear boys," through his tears. 39-year-old Owen and 28-year-old Thomas were then hanged outside the gates of Stafford Jail by William Calcraft, in front of a crowd estimated at 10,000. Until the very end, Thomas insisted, "I did not do this. I had nothing to do with it." Once dead, the three men were buried within the grounds of the jail. As for Christina Collins, she was buried in St. Augustine's Cemetery in Rugeley.